Hi, this is one of several modules on writing. The idea on all these modules is to keep them fairly brief. In this module, we want to talk about some basic ideas on organization. So let me move right into this. So often you're asked to write a paper in many of your classes. Well, as it turns out, there's what we call a traditional approach to an academic paper, and really this organization that you see here is what you might see for a thesis or a dissertation. And a thesis or dissertation typically consists of 5 chapters. And those chapters are as listed here: the introduction in chapter 1, followed by a literature review, and then in the 3rd chapter you discuss your methodology. In the 4th chapter, you present your findings that came from use of your methodology. And then finally, in the 5th chapter, you present a conclusion or several conclusions. So that's really a basic model, and we vary from that often in the kinds of papers that we ask you to write in the MPA program. So let me give you some examples of that. So here's an example that you might see. You might be asked to write a research paper with main categories such as this: the introduction and thesis statement, followed by a literature review, followed by a discussion, followed by conclusions and recommendations. This is an alternative form of paper that I use when I teach policy analysis. So in the paper that is written for that class, we're talking about analyzing a particular public policy. So I start out by asking students to give the background of the policy and move from there to discuss what the policy problem is. That is, why is there a public problem that should be met with a policy? And then there's a section on policy alternatives. So for the problem statement, there may be 3 or 4 or even more different alternatives in the form of policy. Then I ask students to present some criteria for how they would compare those policy alternatives. And then finally, they write a recommended policy solution. So this is yet another variation of that basic form of paper, and there are many other variations that you might encounter. So in any case, here's what's going to happen when you're writing and organizing a paper for a project in one of your PA classes or a term paper. And this really applies equally whether it's an individual paper or a group paper. So typically you're going to introduce a topic, and then you're going to talk about what the literature says, and there's different kinds of literature. And there's another module where we talk about the differences in the kinds of literature and the kinds of sources. Often you're going to use that literature and sources to provide some evidence of the contention that you made in the thesis statement. So that is, you make some argument about a topic in your thesis statement, and the literature is going to help you to discuss, one or more sides of the arguments about your contention. Then often you're going to, use a specific quantitative or qualitative methodology to test that contention. Now, that's not going to apply to all the papers that you write, and there are some very specific ways of making an argument involving a hypothesis that you're going to learn in statistical classes and in methodology classes about how to present an argument based on a hypothesis and how to test it based on statistical measures. But it doesn't always have to be quantitative. Of course, it could be qualitative methodology that you're using, such as interviews. So there are many ways to produce evidence to discuss the contention that you made. And then towards the end, you're going to draw some conclusions based on the findings or based on the literature that you read. And then often you'll make recommendations. Not all papers require you to make recommendations, but many do. Now, there's a few other ideas here that I'm going to talk about just briefly, but we're going to go into more detail in other modules on these topics. Here's the real big takeaway. about writing a paper. Students become frustrated writing a paper often because they view writing a paper as an event. That is, I'm going to sit down on Saturday and Sunday this weekend and write a paper because it's due in class next Wednesday evening or next Tuesday evening. Well, sometimes you might come to that, but for a large project, you should think of writing a paper as a process, not as an event. And that process includes not just writing, but a lot of contemplation over what you're going to write. So here's what I advise students. If you have a term paper due at the end of the semester, and this could be a group paper or an individual paper, really, you should start right away on looking up, compiling, reading, and taking notes on the literature. Start looking at that literature. Start making a list of the literature. Start making your reference list, because what's going to happen is you're going to use some of that literature and some of it you're not going to use. So don't start looking for the literature at the last minute. You're going to get a much better view of the literature if you actually start looking at it right away. Start taking notes on your memos or your ideas. Start writing yourself notes. Start thinking through your thesis or your purpose statement as you originally composed it, and make sure it makes sense to you. Make sure it gives you a path for the rest of your paper. And then, as you're moving along through a semester, start writing that paper in chunks. You know, just on your word processor, just start writing that paper in chunks and have little bits and pieces of it sitting out there that you can keep coming back to. I recommend that a lot of students outline. The Purdue OWL has some great tips on outlining as well. Keep in mind that for any paper, the first draft of a paper is almost never what you're going to turn in, unless you are, you know, an exceptional novelist who can do that, and there aren't really very many who could do that. The first draft is something that you're never going to turn in. You're probably lucky if it doesn't have typos and misspellings in it. It probably will. And you not only want to look for that, but you actually want to look for whether it makes sense. So you're going to read those drafts and you're going to redo them, and you might redo them several times. Finally, when you reach a point after through this process where you have a draft that you're happy with, you actually might want to take some time to read it out loud. This is a trick I've used over the years, and it really works. Take that paper and find yourself a quiet place and read that paper so you can hear your voice, your own voice, and see what it sounds like. Does it make sense to you now that you've done that when you're reading it out loud? And if it doesn't, then you know there's pieces and parts of that paper that you need to go back and revise. So these are just some ideas on papers, but the biggest takeaway here is that really writing a paper is not an event, it's a process. Okay, in this final section of this module, I want to introduce you to the Purdue OWL, which I think is a really good source of for writers, not just academic writing, as well. It has tips for professional writing, tips for writing a resume, tips on making presentations. So I think the Purdue OWL is a really excellent source that you should make use of. And to encourage you to do that, I have this part of this module where I show you some of the things that are in the Purdue OWL. I'm not going to discuss them at length because I'd like you to get into the resource itself and see what it has to say. But you notice I've outlined about 5 different things that have to do with writing a paper. So let me go to each of these briefly. So this first section is tips on writing your thesis statement. And how I got here on the Purdue OWL is I actually went up to the search engine here at the top bar and just wrote in thesis statements, and it came up with this. So that's a good tip on the Purdue OWL, is use the search bar. So you see here that the Purdue OWL right away on thesis statements tells you that there's three basic types of paper: an analytical paper, an expository paper, and an argumentative paper. These three types actually influence the way that your thesis statement is going to be worded. And please take the time to read this. But basically, an analytical paper is going to break down an issue and then analyze it. An expository paper is really just explaining some event or phenomenon. Okay, so the black slide means my talk here is done. As I said, there are many more modules that we will continue to add to the MPA Hub that should help you in your academic endeavors. Thanks very much for listening.